There are moments in life when a man finally tells the truth about the story everyone thinks they already know. There are moments when the fairy tale gets dismantled piece by piece and what emerges is something far more human, far more complicated, and infinitely more tragic. This is that moment. This is the story that Paul Hogan at 85 years old has finally begun to tell. Not the version that Hollywood wrote, not the version that magazines printed. The real story. The one that was unfolding silently behind every red carpet appearance, every film premiere, every photograph of a couple that the world believed had found something rare and beautiful. His name is Paul Hogan, and he was born on October 8, 1939 in Lightning Ridge, New South Wales, Australia. Lightning Ridge is a small town in outback Australia, the kind of place where the sun is relentless and people are tough out of necessity rather than choice. His family was working class. His childhood was unremarkable. When you're a child of the working class in Australia in the 1940s, you don't talk about dreams. You talk about jobs. You talk about surviving. Young Paul showed up. He left school at 15 because there were bills to pay. He drifted through a series of jobs until in his early 30s he landed on the Sydney Harbour Bridge as a rigger. He was ordinary. He was invisible. He was exactly like every other man doing that job except for one thing: he was funny. During a morning tea break in 1971, a joke he told with his coworkers caught someone's attention. Someone saw past the high-visibility vest and the working-class accent, and they saw something that could be shaped into something else. By 1973, Paul Hogan had entered a new face's talent quest. He won. Within months, he had a television show. Within years, he had become a national icon in Australia. The Paul Hogan Show was everything. It was his voice. It was his humor. It was him finally being seen. But the bridge rigger who had become a television star was still at his core a man from a working-class background. He had certain beliefs about how the world should work. He believed in family. He believed in a man providing. He believed in loyalty and commitment, and the idea that a woman's place was in the home, creating stability while the man went out and conquered the world. These weren't beliefs he examined too closely. They were simply what he had absorbed from the culture he grew up in. On the other side of the world, Linda Kozlowski was building a different kind of life. She was born on January 7, 1958 in Fairfield, Connecticut. Her parents had ambitions for her. They encouraged her to study, to pursue the arts, to become something more. At 18 years old, she applied to Juilliard, one of the most prestigious performing arts schools in the world. The acceptance rate is brutal, but Linda was talented. She was driven. She was hungry in the way that only comes from being raised to believe that your potential matters. She graduated from Juilliard in 1981, armed with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and absolutely no guarantees. She performed in off-Broadway productions. She was in the Broadway revival of Death of a Salesman with Dustin Hoffman. She was paying her dues. She was waiting for the role that would change everything. Then in 1985, a casting director thought of her for a film being made in Australia. The film was called Crocodile Dundee. The script had been written by Paul Hogan himself, a man who had decided he wanted to conquer Hollywood. He wanted to prove that a working-class Australian could become a global star. He wanted to build an empire. And the role he had written for Sue Charlton, the American journalist who would fall in love with Mick Dundee in the Outback, was the perfect vehicle for a young actress to launch into stardom. Linda saw the script. She understood immediately that this was it. This was the role that could change everything. She was 27 years old. She said yes before she even arrived in Australia. What neither of them understood was what would happen when these two people, coming from such different worlds, working with such different assumptions about love and marriage and partnership, came together on a film set in the Australian outback. The chemistry was undeniable. It was written on every frame of the film. When Paul Hogan at 46 years old looked at Linda Kozlowski at 27 years old, something shifted. The problem was that Paul was already married. He had been married to Nolene Edwards since 1958. They had 5 children together, but on a film set in the middle of nowhere while the cameras rolled, Paul fell in love with someone else. Crocodile Dundee was released in 1986. It made $300 million. It was a cultural phenomenon. Paul Hogan was suddenly a global star, and Linda Kozlowski was suddenly not an obscure performer anymore. She was golden. She was nominated for a Golden Globe. In 1986, Paul filed for divorce from Nolene. By 1990, Paul and Linda were married. It was a fairy tale. It was romantic. It was the kind of thing that people point to and say, see, love can happen anywhere. Love can transform your entire life. What nobody was asking was the question that should have been asked from the beginning. What did Linda have to give up to make this fairy tale real? In the early years, the marriage seemed perfect. Paul and Linda made films together. Almost an Angel, Crocodile Dundee 2, They presented themselves to the world as a power couple. Paul showered Linda with gifts. He built her a custom mansion. He provided for her in every material way. But material provision is not the same as emotional presence. It's not the same as seeing someone. It's not the same as allowing someone to become who they are actually capable of becoming. By the mid-1990s, the cracks were starting to show. Linda was still young, she was still talented, she was still hungry, but Paul wanted something different. He wanted stability. He wanted a wife who would be home. He wanted children who would have a father present. He wanted a traditional family, the kind of family that made sense to Bridge Rigger's son. He wanted Linda to stop chasing roles and to start chasing the thing that he believed should matter more: family, home, domesticity. In 1998, when Linda was 40 years old, they had a son. Chance. Paul, at 58, threw himself into fatherhood with intensity. He was present, he was engaged, and Linda became a mother. That part was real, but something else was happening. Linda's career was shrinking. The scripts that came across her desk were not the quality of scripts she once received. She was being offered roles as the love interest. She was being offered roles as the wife. She was being offered the thing that every aging actress fears. She spoke about it, she was honest. She said that the scripts gave her ulcers. She said that they were shallow. She said that she felt like she was being put in boxes that made no sense for someone who had trained at Juilliard, who had performed on Broadway. But when she spoke about wanting to keep acting, Paul didn't hear what she was actually saying. Or he heard it, but he didn't know what to do with it. He had a framework for marriage, and it didn't include a wife who needed to be something other than a wife and a mother. Friends who knew Linda during this period described her as increasingly withdrawn. She was still there, she was still showing up, but the light inside her was dimming. She felt imprisoned, they said. She felt like she was losing herself. She felt like the woman who had worked so hard to become Linda Kozlowski, the actress, was disappearing into the role of Linda Hogan, the wife. This is the tragedy of the story. Paul loved Linda, but his love came with conditions. It came with the expectation that she would reshape her life around his vision. It came with the assumption that providing financially was equivalent to providing everything. It came with the belief that if he was happy, if the family was stable, then she should be happy too, but she wasn't happy, she was suffocating. By the early 2000s, Linda had essentially stopped acting. Her last film was Crocodile Dundee and Los Angels in 2001. After that, nothing. She was 56 years old, still beautiful, still talented, but she had accepted the role that Paul wanted her to play. The role of the wife, the role of the mother, the role of the woman who had sacrificed her ambitions for the sake of a family. But the sacrifice was not bringing her peace. It was bringing her increasing bitterness. She and Paul were living in the same house, but they were increasingly living separate lives. He was consumed by work. He was traveling. She was at home, watching him build the empire and wondering what had happened to the woman she had been. Then in 2003, everything became more complicated. Paul was caught up in a massive investigation by the Australian Taxation Office, Operation Wickenby. They said he had hidden millions of dollars in offshore accounts. For 7 years, the investigation dragged on. In 2010, when Paul went back to Australia for his mother's funeral, they barred him from leaving. He couldn't leave his own country until he resolved his alleged tax debt. 37.5 million Australian dollars. Eventually, the charges were dropped. A confidential settlement was reached, but something had broken inside Paul. The charisma that had always come so easily to him became harder to access. He had been knocked down, and the process of getting back up was slower and more painful than he had anticipated. During all of this, Linda was watching. She was watching the man she had married become increasingly stressed, increasingly withdrawn, increasingly obsessed with defending his reputation. And he was watching her become increasingly distant, increasingly unhappy, increasingly absent from the life they had built together. By 2013, Linda had made a decision. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't pretend. She couldn't sacrifice. She couldn't reshape herself into the mold that Paul had created for her. She filed for divorce in Los Angeles Superior Court. She was 55 years old, Paul was 74, their son Chance was 15. She cited irreconcilable differences. Everything was different. They wanted different things. They needed different things. They had become different people, and there was no way to bridge that gap. The divorce was finalized in 2014. Paul kept Crocodile Dundee. He kept the company that owned Crocodile Dundee. He kept the thing that had brought them together. Linda received a settlement of $6.25 million, no spousal support, no ongoing financial ties. They agreed to share custody of Chance, and Linda was granted the right to remain in their Los Angeles home for 4 years or until she remarried. When she was asked to comment on the split, Linda said something that contained the entire weight of the marriage. She said, "I lived in Paul's shadow for many, many years, and it's nice to feel my own light right now." That sentence is heartbreaking because it's true. That sentence is everything. What happened next is where the story becomes something else entirely. Linda didn't collapse, she didn't fall apart. She did something that most people wouldn't have the courage to do. She completely reinvented herself. Within a year of the divorce, she had met a businessman named Moulay Hafid Baba. Instead of getting married immediately, instead of trying to find another man to reshape her life around, she built a business with him. They created Dream My Destiny, a luxury tourism and film location scouting company based in Marrakech, Morocco. Linda was finally doing something that was entirely her own. It wasn't for a man, it wasn't for a family, it was for her. She also became a shrewd real estate investor. With her settlement, she purchased multiple properties in Venice Beach. She rented them out, she bought more, she built wealth not by being given wealth but by making intelligent decisions. A neighbor described her as really smart and noted how she had turned her settlement into millions more. Linda was finally the person she had always wanted to be. She was independent, she was creative, she was building something on her own terms. She was spending part of the year in Morocco and part in Los Angeles. She was living exactly as she wanted to live. She was 56 years old and she was becoming herself for the first time in nearly 25 years. Paul, meanwhile, stayed in their old Venice Beach home with Chance. He was still recognized as an Australian legend, but something was hollow inside him. The charisma that had always defined him became harder to access. He didn't tour, he didn't perform, he became increasingly reclusive. And then his body started to betray him in ways that he couldn't hide anymore. He developed retroperitoneal fibrosis, a rare medical condition in which a benign growth forms in the abdomen and wraps around vital organs, including his aorta and his kidney. The growth had to be surgically removed and the procedure caused significant trauma to his body. He began to physically shrink. His face became gaunt. His body, the body that had once represented rugged masculinity and strength, became fragile and diminished. By his mid-80s, Paul Hogan looked nothing like the man who had played Mick Dundee. He looked like what he actually was, an aging man, a man who had lost something that he couldn't get back, a man who was living with regret. Recent photographs showed him using a wheelchair. He had become fragile in a way that shocked people who had known him in his prime. In interviews during this period, Paul began to say things that he had never said before. He admitted that providing financially was never a substitute for emotional closeness. He admitted that his definition of love, the definition he had inherited from his working-class Australian upbringing, was too narrow to hold a woman like Linda. He admitted that he had loved her deeply, but that his love had been shaped by expectations rather than flexibility. He admitted that he had wanted to protect her, to provide for her, to shape her into the version of a wife and a mother that he believed she should be. And in doing that, he had lost her. He said something that finally cracked open everything he had been holding closed. He said, "I once had it all, fame, fortune, a wonderful wife, but in the end I still feel like I lost something most important." He wasn't talking about money. He wasn't talking about fame. He was talking about Linda. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, and in getting exactly what he wanted, he had lost the thing that actually mattered. In 2025, nearly a decade and a half after the divorce, something unexpected happened. Crocodile Dundee was remastered in glorious 4K and released back into theaters as the encore cut. It was a nostalgia play, but it was also perhaps a way to bring Paul and Linda back together. They reunited to promote the film. Paul was 85, he was frail, he was marked by illness and age and regret. Linda was 67, she was healthy, she was vibrant, she was living the life that she had earned by finally choosing herself. When they stood next to each other for the cameras, something of the old magic was still there. You could see it. You could see why they had fallen in love on that film set all those years ago, but there was also something else. There was sadness. There was the recognition that some things once lost can never be reclaimed. Paul looked at Linda the way a man looks at something he once had and understood too late that it was precious. Linda looked at Paul with compassion but also with distance. She had moved on, she had become herself. She was no longer the woman waiting for permission to be who she was supposed to be. In an interview during the reunion, Paul was asked about Linda. He paused, and then he said something that contained everything. He said, "I loved her deeply, but sometimes love just isn't enough." It was both a confession and an epitaph for a marriage that had once captivated millions. That is the story, that is the real story, not a fairy tale, not a romance that conquered the world. A story about a man who had everything and lost the thing that actually mattered because he didn't know how to love someone in a way that allowed them to be themselves. A story about a woman who had to choose between staying small and becoming herself. A story about what happens when two people love each other, but their versions of love are incompatible. Paul Hogan conquered Australia. He conquered Hollywood. He He built an empire, but at 85 years old living alone in a Venice beach home, dealing with health problems and the weight of years spent chasing the wrong things, he finally understood what he should have understood all along. That the woman who had changed his life by saying yes to a role in a film about a crocodile hunter was not his to change. She was his to cherish. She was his to support in becoming exactly who she wanted to become. And because he didn't understand that, because he tried to shape her instead of letting her grow, he lost her. Linda Kozlowski, at 67 years old, living in Morocco and building a life entirely on her own terms, finally got to be the person she was always supposed to be. It took a divorce to get there. It took leaving the man she loved to find herself, but she did it, and in doing it she became the real hero of the story. The story of Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski is not a tragedy because they stopped loving each other. It's a tragedy because they loved each other in ways that were fundamentally incompatible. He loved her by trying to protect her. She needed to be free. He loved her by providing. She needed to be seen. He loved her by building a family. She needed to be an artist. And in the space between those two versions of love, their marriage died. Sometimes the greatest love stories are not the ones that end in forever. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones where two people, realizing they cannot stay together without destroying each other, have the courage to let go.